Most people think what just happened in Washington was another boring trade hearing. It wasn't. It was a moment that quietly exposed how North American trade really works and why Canada may be walking into the most dangerous economic fight in decades. Because this time, the truth didn't slip out in a leaked document. It came straight from the mouth of the U.S. Treasury Secretary. A senator leaned forward and asked a question so simple it should have had an easy answer. If Canada erased every tariff on American goods, every single one, would the United States do the same in return? Would Canadian companies finally compete on equal ground? The room went silent. Then the Treasury Secretary answered, no. Not maybe, not we'll see. Not let's negotiate, just no. In that single word, decades of talk about fair trade collapsed. Even if Canada surrendered everything, Washington would give nothing back. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't really about tariffs, it was about power. Because what followed revealed something much bigger, something tied directly to a meeting that happened 3 weeks earlier on the other side of the world, in Beijing. That's where Canada's Prime Minister landed on January 16th, marking the first official visit to China in years. The cameras flashed, the handshakes were formal, and then the doors closed. Inside, negotiations began with President Xi. By the time the meeting ended, Canada had a deal, a massive one. Canada agreed to lower tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, dropping them from a crushing 100% down to just 6.1%. In return, China slashed its punishment tariffs on Canadian canola seeds from 84% down to 15%. Even bigger, Beijing removed tariffs on lobster, crab, peas, and canola meal. Billions of dollars in frozen exports suddenly came back to life. For Canadian farmers and fisheries, it was a lifeline. But in Washington, it was treated like betrayal. American officials went on television almost immediately. They warned that Canada was becoming a drop-off point for Chinese goods. They accused Ottawa of opening a backdoor into the U.S. market. They spoke as if the entire North American auto industry had just been handed over to Beijing. But here's the part almost nobody mentioned. The agreement limited Chinese EV imports to just 49,000 vehicles in the first year. That's under 3% of Canada's car market. Roughly the same number Canada had already been importing before tariffs exploded. This wasn't a flood, it was a controlled valve. Yet Washington reacted like a dam had burst, and that reaction revealed what this was truly about. Not electric cars, not canola, control. Because for years, Canada had mirrored U.S. trade policy almost automatically. When Washington hit China with tariffs, Canada followed. When the U.S. blocked Chinese EVs, Canada blocked them too. Ottawa stayed in lockstep, until now, and that shift terrified American policymakers. Not because of the numbers, but because of what it symbolized. For the first time in years, Canada made a major economic move without asking Washington first. That's what shook them: economic independence, strategic choice, sovereignty. And suddenly, that quiet Senate hearing made sense. Because the Treasury Secretary wasn't answering a tariff question. He was sending a warning. Even total obedience wouldn't earn Canada equal treatment, which is when another truth surfaced, right there on camera. The same official who had spent months insisting tariffs wouldn't raise prices admitted he had been wrong. Inflation had been affected. Consumers were paying more. He walked back his earlier testimony in real time, a rare public reversal, and that moment mattered because it showed that Washington wasn't just pressuring allies. It was doing it while denying the real economic damage. And while this drama played out in the U.S., Canada was dealing with something far more urgent: retaliation. When Ottawa first raised tariffs on Chinese EVs in 2024, Beijing didn't hesitate. They struck back hard. A 100% tariff slammed Canadian canola oil. 25% hit pork and seafood. Then came the brutal blow: over 76% duties on canola seeds. Saskatchewan alone produces nearly half of Canada's canola. An industry worth hundreds of billions suddenly watched its second largest market disappear almost overnight. Farmers couldn't sell, prices crashed, bankruptcies loomed, an anti-dumping investigation threatened to make things even worse. That was the economic reality behind the Beijing trip. This wasn't politics, it was survival. And the New Deal reversed the damage almost instantly. Tariffs fell, markets reopened, exports restarted, even travel between the two countries improved as China removed visa restrictions for Canadians. Trade channels that had been frozen for years began moving again. It wasn't just a reset, it was a rebuilding. But Washington didn't celebrate Canada's recovery. Instead, it tightened pressure, because looming in the background was a date that changes everything. July 1st, 2026. The USMCA review, the moment when the United States, Canada, and Mexico decide whether their trade agreement continues or slowly collapses into annual renegotiations until it expires entirely in 2036. And Washington knows something critical. Canada needs this deal more than the US does, which gives America leverage. And they're already using it. Officials have made their position clear. They want tighter auto rules, more US content in manufacturing, stronger enforcement against Chinese goods moving through North America, and restrictions on Canada making trade deals with countries Washington doesn't like. Not partnership, permission. The Treasury Secretary's blunt Senate answer wasn't careless. It was strategy. A message before negotiations even begin. Total concession won't be enough. What makes this moment so dangerous isn't just tariffs or angry press conferences. It's the shift in how power is being used. For decades, North American trade was built on predictability. Disagreements happened, sure, but the foundation was cooperation. When problems came up, leaders negotiated behind closed doors. Allies didn't publicly threaten each other's economies. That era is quietly ending. And Canada is learning that in real time. Because while Washington keeps talking about fair trade, its actions are about leverage, about reminding smaller partners who controls access to the world's largest market. The Treasury Secretary wasn't hiding it when he pointed out that the U.S. economy is multiples larger than Canada's. That wasn't an economic observation. It was a power statement, a way of saying, we can hurt you more than you can hurt us. And in raw numbers, that's true. Nearly 75% of Canada's exports go straight to the United States. About $400 billion in goods every year cross that border. Cars, oil, electricity, aluminum, lumber, food, supply chains so intertwined that some products cross the border half a dozen times before they're finished. The two economies are stitched together, but that integration created imbalance. When Washington raises tariffs, Canadian industries feel pain immediately. When Canada responds, the U.S. barely notices. And American officials know it, which is why pressure has replaced partnership. But here's what Washington didn't expect. Instead of backing down, Canada started looking outward. The China deal wasn't a one-off. Behind the scenes, Ottawa opened talks with the European Union, India, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN nations. Quiet trade discussions multiplied. New export routes were explored. Investment agreements were reconsidered. For the first time in generations, Canada began seriously reducing its dependence on a single market. And that possibility scares Washington more than any Chinese electric vehicle ever could. Because if Canada succeeds in diversifying, if that 75% drops to 60 or 50, American leverage weakens. Tariffs stop being a weapon. Threats stop working. Suddenly, Canada has options. And once one country proves it can loosen the grip of economic dependence, others start asking the same question. Mexico is watching. European countries are watching. Asian economies are watching. The lesson being taught isn't about China. It's about vulnerability. Build your economy around one superpower, and that superpower can squeeze you whenever it wants. Diversify, or be controlled. And Washington knows it's sending that message to the world, which is why pressure is escalating ahead of the USMCA review. Officials are already floating demands that would effectively lock Canada into U.S. trade policy permanently. Restrictions on who Canada can trade with, requirements that favor American manufacturing, barriers disguised as security measures, not cooperation, compliance. And that brings us back to the public narrative about Chinese EVs. Because while American leaders warn about Chinese cars flooding Canada, the reality is far more complicated. Many of those vehicles are built by Western companies. Volvo manufactures in China. Polestar does too. Even Tesla has Chinese production lines. So when Canada imports an EV made in Shanghai, is that a Chinese car or a Swedish or American one built in a global supply chain? The modern economy doesn't fit neatly into political talking points. Factories span continents. Parts come from dozens of countries. Trying to isolate trade by nationality is like trying to block the internet by country. It ignores how globalization actually works. But that nuance disappears when pressure is the goal. Because the story isn't about protecting industry, it's about controlling partners. And while this plays out, another truth quietly surfaced, one Washington would rather ignore. Tariffs are fueling inflation. Despite claims to the contrary, prices are rising. American families pay more for imported goods. Canadian consumers pay more in retaliation. Supply chains slow. Interest rates stay higher. The Federal Reserve hesitates to cut. Economic strain builds on both sides of the border, yet publicly officials downplay it, because admitting tariffs hurt voters would collapse the entire trade war narrative. So instead, reality is brushed aside, and there's another hidden cost most people don't talk about: tourism. Canadians are traveling south far less than before. So are Europeans and Asians. Trade tension, harsh rhetoric, border friction, all of it discourages visitors. The U.S. Travel Association now predicts a $70 billion tourism deficit, $70 billion gone from the American economy, and no amount of domestic travel can replace that loss. It isn't new spending, it's just reshuffling what already existed. Yet even this damage is brushed off, which tells you something important. The pressure campaign isn't about economic health, it's about dominance. So where does that leave Canada? Standing at a crossroads. One path is submission. Cancel the China deal. Apologize for Davos. Align fully with Washington's trade policy. Hope for mercy during USMCA negotiations. But history shows appeasement rarely works. Give ground, and more is demanded. Show weakness, and pressure increases. The other path is far harder. Diversify trade. Build alternatives. Accept short-term pain for long-term independence. Prove Canada can stand without constant U.S. approval. It risks retaliation. It invites economic discomfort. It requires political courage, but it also offers sovereignty. Because the real question isn't about tariffs. It's about whether Canada is a partner or a client state. Whether its future is decided in Ottawa or in Washington. Whether its flag represents real independence or symbolic autonomy. The USMCA review will decide far more than trade rules. It will reveal whether North America continues as a partnership or shifts into hierarchy. Washington has already shown its hand. Equality isn't the goal, control is, and Canada now has to choose: comply and remain economically dependent, or compete and risk everything to build a freer future. 4 months stand between those two paths. 4 months until negotiations begin. 4 months until pressure turns into reality. And the choice made now will shape Canada's economy for generations. If this story opened your eyes to what's really happening behind the headlines, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it. Because these decisions are being made quietly, and the more people understand the stakes, the harder it becomes to control the narrative. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Canada should stand firm and diversify, or play it safe and stay in Washington's orbit? Drop your opinion in the comments.